Most of us know what to do when we need to shape up, right? If you know that you need to shape up, you've discovered something about yourself, you try to fix it. Your cholesterol is high. Your triglyceride levels, whatever those things are elevated. Well, you don't know and understand it all, but one thing that you do know is that you need to shape up and you need to do something about it. And so you start an exercise program or you adjust your diet, right? Right? Well, at least you know what to do. Actually, doing it is a little harder, isn't it? You know, it can be very, very difficult. But if you search yourself deeply, if you look at the resources that you have around you, if you draw strength from God above you, you can do it, can't you? It can be done. It might be difficult, but it's doable. You know, you might be talking with somebody, and in the midst of talking to them, they kind of give you a blank stare. So you adjust. I'm here, look at me. You try to get their attention, right? Or perhaps someone walks away from you at a party. You check things out. You want to make sure that everything is right. You can adjust. It's doable. So when you learn that you need to shape up in some way, you can make the changes even if it's difficult. There are resources to help you. Now, helping another person shape up is infinitely more difficult. And that's the task that Paul has in our text today. There's troublemakers in the church. There's dissension, there's challenges, there's backbiting, there's gossip. There's factions that occur. And Paul, their pastor, who founded this church, comes to them and says, you gotta shape up. And he addresses some specific issues to help these baby Christians who are really behaving like babies be able to grow up and to be strong. He wants them to grow up and be strong. He's going to come and visit them. And he wants to know, how is it going to be when he gets there? Is he going to embrace them like a loving father, or is he going to have to pull out his stick and start directing them and disciplining them? This is the question that faces Paul as he writes the Corinthians. And as he writes them, he's very aware of his position before them. And I think that some of you, some of us here, who are in a position to help another person shape up, could take some lessons from the attitude and the actions of Paul in our text here today. Perhaps you have taken time to try to listen to a person. Perhaps you've taken time to try to understand them. You've taken time to pray. And certainly you're concerned that they might reject you if you seek to offer any corrective actions. You're concerned that they might think that you are being self-righteous. But you are in a position that can offer some support and encouragement to help that other person grow. You're their parent, or you're their coach, or you're their teacher, or you're their boss, or you're the head of the committee, or you're in some position of responsibility and authority. And so, what is it that you can learn from Paul in this text for helping another person? Well, Paul tells us here that his attitude is one that I believe all of us ought to have when it comes to using the position that we might have to help another. He says, I come to you not to scold you. I come to you not to shame you. I don't want to put you down. I don't want to hurt you. But I come as a parent, a loving parent. He's the one that started this church in the first place. And he sees himself as a parent who's suffering in love for this church in Corinth that is getting ripped apart. The body is just aching. And he wants them to live as the family of God. And so he tells them, I'm coming to you as a parent. And here's the attitude that he comes as a parent. He doesn't come as the boss man. You know, some of us have had that way of parenting that has been directed towards us. I'm your parent and you better do that. Why? Because I said so, right? We all have heard that. Maybe we've said it. But the attitude that Paul comes to the Christians in Corinth with is an attitude of being a servant and a minister. He says this in the very first verse of the text. I come to you as a servant. The word in the Greek is very telling. It's uperetos. And it literally means a rower or an under rower, one who rows a boat. And as the Corinthians received this letter from Paul, they understood what those words meant because they lived near the sea. They were on a 6-mile isthmus in between the Aegean Sea in the east and the Ionian Sea in the west that faced towards Rome. And there they were in the middle, and when warships were going to cut through the isthmus, they would be carried over land and they'd see them pass by their city. And on those warships, there was the section for the rowers. And there were the under rowers in the lowest section of the boat, and the captain would sit above them. And on one side of the lower section, there would be a single bench, and on the other side, there would be another single bench. And the rowers would straddle that bench and stick their oars out and row along. And up front was the captain seated higher above them. And he would give the commands. When he said move forward, they'd move forward. When he said pull backward, they'd pull backward. And he'd follow the guide of the captain. And what Paul is telling us in this text is that I am an under rower. I'm not the captain sitting up front. I'm not the captain, and neither are any of the apostles. But we're all under rowers with Christ in the captain's seat. Christ is the pilot. And that's the attitude that I believe that each one of us needs to have if we're in a position of responsibility or authority to help another person. We must see ourselves always under the authority of Christ and always looking for the cadence of Christ to be directing our actions. I have a sister who is the tiny one in the family, and she was a coxswain on a boat at school. On the East Coast and on the West Coast, there's lots of colleges that have crew teams or rowing teams. So she was the one that yelled the orders to all the rowers to do their thing. And what Paul is telling us is to listen to the coxswain call of Jesus and consider ourselves as a parent being a servant to the others. Another way this word uberetos is translated is with the word minister. And there's some government positions in some countries that have picked up this same language, especially in Great Britain. You have the Minister of Defense, the Minister of the Interior. We have secretaries, but they call them ministers. And the etymology of that term goes back to this same ubereto, meaning we're a minister or a servant, because any minister who's a leader in the government is an underservant to someone who has higher authority. Even the prime minister is a minister and is under the authority of another. And so when Paul says that he's writing to the church in Corinth as a parent and as an under rower, he's saying, I'm doing this because God's call is directing me, and I'm seeking to listen to God's call. And we would do well to have the same kind of attitude in our various relations as a doctor or as a coach or a teacher or a parent. Now, another word that Paul uses to describe himself is the word that we translate steward. And I like that word, a steward. The Greek word is the word oikonomos. Oikonomos. Oikos is a house, and nomos is an administrator or servant in the house. And so Paul sees himself as a household servant. And I think that the translation steward is a pretty good word for this translation here. Do you remember the day when there used to be stewards in the sky and stewardesses in the sky? We don't have that so much anymore. We have a different name, a flight attendant. But I remember, what did the stewardess do for you? She got your coffee, she got your tea, she got your cigarettes for you, right? Oh my goodness, I remember when I was a little kid and that stewardess would get cigarettes for the guy in front of me in the smoking section. I was in the no smoking section, but I was smoking his cigarette all the same. But those stewardesses and those stewards were there to serve us, but not just to serve us, they'd also be there to keep us safe. Remember, they showed us how to fasten our seatbelts. I think if anybody needs instructions on fastening that seatbelt, they have more needs and probably shouldn't be flying that plane. But that's another matter. They show you how to fasten the seatbelt, but they also show you how to put on the safety vest. And those are a little bit more complicated. So you need to remember. And those sweet stewards and sweet stewardesses, if the plane starts to go down, they start barking orders and they move into action. And in our text today, Paul is moving into action. And he starts barking orders in a way that is caring and loving and supportive. He sees himself craving the health of this body of Christ, the church. And so he calls on them, he appeals to them to love one another and to support one another and to care for one another, with Jesus as the pilot. Now, we know there's another Pilate in the Bible, the governor Pilate in Palestine area that Jesus was confronted by and arrested by, and Jesus appeared before Pilate. And you remember what Pilate said before Jesus? This Pilate thought he was in charge. And this Pilate said to Jesus, "Where do you get your authority?" And Jesus answered, "My authority does not come from this world. I have a kingdom not of this world. If my kingdom was of this world, my servants would fight. My ubereto, my ministers, my disciples," that's the word that's used, they would fight. And Jesus wasn't a fighter. He was a lover. And he taught the new commandment was to love. And sometimes love is hard, and sometimes love is difficult, and sometimes love has to bark out orders, and sometimes love is distressed, but love all the same. This is a love boat. It's a fellowship. It's a fellowship. It's not like that love boat that you might have seen on TV years back. Not that one. But this is a beautiful fellowship. And Paul says, let nothing destroy that fellowship. And so he does everything he can to help them to shape up. And it's hard. And I think we all learn from Paul the perspective or the attitude that we need if we're in a position to try to help another person to shape up. It needs to be that attitude of a servant. It needs to be that attitude of a steward of the Lord's. It needs to be as a parent, caring for another person. And Paul also shows us two ways that he approached this church in Corinth. There's two main kind of approaches that he has in this particular text, and he uses other approaches in other chapters. But you might notice here in the text that we read today, there's a lot of sarcasm here. Did you catch that? Yes? There's a great amount of sarcasm. Oh, you think that you are masters of your own kingdom? I wish I was a part of your kingdom. Yeah, we could all celebrate together. Oh yeah, put me in your parade. Put me at the very end of your parade. I'll come at the end. Because I'm a fool for Christ. You're wise for Christ. I'll be the fool for Christ. I'll even die for Christ. A good bit of sarcasm there. And the image that he's using is the kind of parade that the Corinthian Christians were well aware of and oftentimes participated in. Because when a victor general came back from fighting a war, they would parade throughout the streets, and everyone would hold up the spoils of war, all the gold and all the cups and all the jewelry that they'd stolen at war, or that they'd gained from war, call it stealing or whatever. But as they came into the city, they would be marching along in a parade, and who would be at the end? It wasn't the horses and the pooper scoopers and back behind them, like in the Rose Bowl parade. It's the people that are cleaning up. But you know what? Who was in the end of the parade there? It was the prisoners. The prisoners. And Paul is saying, I'm like a prisoner for Christ. And me and all the other apostles are that way. Let us be fools for Christ. And you know what they did with those prisoners that were carted at the end of a victory march into the city? They would take those prisoners and they would take them into the arena, and they would have to fight in the arena, all the animals that were brought out. And Paul was saying, I'm willing to die for Christ. That's what I'm willing to do for you. And he uses some very powerful sarcasm in trying to get his point across. Any of you ever use a little sarcasm with your children? I had a mother that had a gift of sarcasm. Matter of fact, before she died, I was talking with her. I said, Mom, how did you raise us 5 kids? All pretty much by yourself, and having a military sergeant that you were always supporting. And she said, well, I had the gift of sarcasm. And I said, yes, you did. I guess I have it too. But she would oftentimes say, you kids are going to put me in the funny farm. And we'd be driving her crazy. Or she'd say, you've just given me another gray root. Look at it. We'd dig in and look at her hair. Oh, yeah, we see those roots. That's me. We're the responsible one there. And so what happens in the text is Paul uses that kind of gift of sarcasm to wake them up and shake them up, to help them to shape up. And then he also encourages them to use their minds, because these people are very into consulting their brains. They see themselves as the intelligentsia of the region. They're Corinth. And Corinth is just in ruins now, but it was bigger than Athens in the day. That and Ephesus were huge cities, and they saw themselves as a center of learning and a center of intellect. And so Paul says, okay, use that brain of yours and use it to remember. Remember what God has done for you in Christ, and remember the message that I brought to you so many years ago. Just remember. I love that song by Andre Crouch. Back when I was a kid, we used to sing it. Take me back, oh Lord, to the place where I first received you. Any of you live on that song as a child? Take me back. It's an old gospel song back in the 70s, I guess. Jesus people days. That's when I came to Christ. And that's when Christ made a difference in my life. And Paul is saying, go back to that place where Christ is really making a difference in your life. And it's a hard thing to do for a person to change. And it's so much harder to try to encourage someone to change, and yet it's worth it. This past week, I was listening to a woman named Eleanor Smith report her findings on helping men to change in Australia. Especially machismo, catcalling men at King's Cross in Sydney, Australia. Any of you ever been there? There's these men that will just stand out on the street by King's Cross, and they'll just catcall at the women. And this one sociologist that teaches at Sydney University decided she was just going to put on a dress and go walking along King's Cross, and the first guy that she would catcall at her, she'd just turn around and talk to him. And she did, and she would ask if she could record the conversation. And some of them would say yes, some would say no. But she had hundreds of conversations with men who were out catcalling. And the conversations would go something like this. What did you mean by what you just said to me? Why did you say it? Do you realize women don't like having that kind of thing said to them? Do you realize that 80% of women find that offensive? And she talked to this one machismo Aussie who just couldn't get it. Just wouldn't get it. He says, oh no, I'm complimenting the women. Oh, you are? He goes, yeah. Sometimes even I'll see a group of 10 or 12 women walking together, and I'll just go walk in the pack and I'll slap one of them on the rear. They like it. It's a compliment, especially that one. Everybody's jealous of that one that she got slapped. And she goes, so you find it helpful and meaningful to affirm someone by assaulting them sexually? He goes, no, I never think of that. And then she reached out the statistics and shared with this man. And then she went back and met with him again and again. And over 120 hours of talking with this man, and she said, I really liked him. He was a nice guy. He just needed to change. And so in a caring way, she shared information with him, and he finally said, you know what, I'm not going to slap anybody on the backside again. Will you stop catcalling then? Well, no, I'll still do that a little bit, but I might adjust it a bit. It's very difficult to change, but I think she had a bit of the spirit of Paul in her, firm and strong, but loving and kind. And I think if we are to help somebody in our midst, a family member, a friend, someone we've prayed for, someone that we're concerned about, someone that we want to help support, that we can have that same kind of attitude as a loving parent and support them. But some of us ourselves also need to receive the correction of those around us. I was mentioning in first service, my wife, she wanted a dog, as you all know. He's going to stop being in, I think this is the last sermon I'm going to mention my dog. But you know, he's a new member of our family. But before he became a member of our family, he became a family member that I resisted. Because my wife said, I want a dog, and I said, I do not. And then my son was visiting, and he said, Dad, you need to let Mom have a dog. And I said, well, I don't want a dog. And he said, well, you should let her have one. She does a lot for you, and she wants one. Don't you love her? And so I have a dog because I love my wife. And now I love that dog because my wife loves the dog. Because people can change, right? People can change. But it could be that there's some other ways for you and for me that God wants to use others to help us change, to help us respond, to get the help and support that we need. The body needs to get stronger. Our bodies, the church body, God's people everywhere need to be getting stronger. What do we need to do to let that happen, to make that happen? I know this past week, my oldest son, was sleeping in his bedroom, woke up, and there was a bat in his room. That's where he sleeps with his wife and with their son, their little grandson. They'll cuddle in there, and the dog will go in there. He sees the bat, and he tries to shoo the bat out. He works to get this bat out, finally scares it out, and the bat winds up flying in his face while it's going out the door. And they weren't even sure whether it got out the door. And so his wife was concerned that maybe he might have been infected. And we know that bats carry rabies, and we know that rabies kill. And so he contacts a doctor friend of his who's in a church small group with him. They meet for Bible study regularly, and so he texted this Christian doctor friend of his and said, hey, this thing happened, and his friend said, you have to get shots. And he didn't like that answer. So there's another doctor friend of his who's in that group as well. So he contacted that doctor. And that doctor said, yeah, you need to get shots, and you need to get them now. And not only do you need to get them, but every member of your family needs to get them, and your dog. And he didn't like that answer. So he remembered he has another doctor friend who went to school with him, and so he reached out to that doctor friend of his. And he said the same thing, if you don't get shots and that bat was rabid, you will die. And he reached out to two other doctor friends, and they said the same thing. So he finally started to get the idea that he might need, for the health of his body, to go and get the shots. Well, I don't know what you need to do for your health of your body, for your growth as a Christian, but it might be that God could use somebody in your life to help instruct you and to help encourage you. Just like my son helped encourage me, God uses all sorts of people in our lives. Are we open to it? God is in the process of working in leaders who have to do works of correction and support and encouragement, and God is in the process of working in all of us who need correction, support, and encouragement. How is it that we grow and open ourselves up to God in the midst of the process? How is God working in your life? And how will you and me, how will all of us together open ourselves up to the Spirit of Jesus? Let's think about that in prayer, shall we? And let's take a moment of quiet together.